Jennifer leaned forward, her eyes fixed on Davis, who sat across from her with a confident smile. They had been meeting like this for months now, their affair carefully hidden in the expensive corners of the city. The soft clinking of cutlery and the gentle hum of conversation filled the upscale restaurant. Candlelight flickered on polished tables, casting shadows on the walls. "Don't worry," she whispered, swirling the wine in her glass. "It's only a matter of time before everything falls into place." Davis's eyes gleamed as he reached for her hand, his touch warm and familiar. "You know I'd give you everything," he said smoothly. "You deserve so much more than him." Jennifer's smile faltered for just a second. She let her fingers curl around his, feeling the weight of the words between them. "He's been good to me," she admitted quietly. "But with you, it's different. I feel alive. It's excitement, freedom." Their fingers intertwined, and for a moment, it felt like nothing else mattered. But then, from the corner of her eye, she saw a figure standing still just inside the entrance of the restaurant. Her breath caught in her throat. Harry, her son, stood frozen, his eyes locked on her, wide with disbelief. He was supposed to be at his university miles away. His face was pale, a mixture of shock and anger rippling across his features. "Mom!" Harry's voice was low, strained. The single word hit her like a punch to the gut. Jennifer's heart slammed against her chest, panic surging through her. Without thinking, she pulled her hand away from Davis's, pushing back her chair as she stood. "Harry!" she called out, her voice barely masking the fear. Her legs moved on instinct as she rushed toward him, her mind scrambling for an explanation, an excuse. She grabbed his arm and pulled him away from the main dining area, steering him toward a quiet corner near the hallway leading to the restrooms. The dim lighting did nothing to soften the intensity of Harry's glare. His jaw was clenched tight, his fists curled at his sides. He said nothing, just waited. "Listen," Jennifer began, her voice trembling. "This isn't what it looks like. It's complicated." Harry crossed his arms, his eyes hard. "What's complicated about you cheating on Dad?" She winced at the bluntness of his words, her stomach twisting. "It's not that simple, Harry. Your father and we've been having problems for a long time. That's how you justify this?" He shot back, his voice rising slightly. "Problems? So you just sneak around behind his back?" Jennifer stepped closer, lowering her voice, trying to regain control. "Please, don't tell your father about this." Harry stared at her, disbelief etched on his face. "Why shouldn't I?" Her mind raced. She had to say something, anything to keep him quiet. "Because," she stammered, "I'll make sure you have everything you want. Anything you've ever dreamed of, cars, money, whatever you need, I'll take care of it. You like expensive things, right? I can give you a new life, a new dad, one who's rich, who can buy you everything." For a moment, Harry just stared at her, his expression unreadable. She couldn't tell if he was considering it or if he was about to walk out and destroy everything. The silence between them stretched painfully. "You think that's what I want?" Harry asked finally, his voice low and bitter. "To be bought off? To have some rich dad replace the one who actually cares about me?" Jennifer swallowed hard, her throat dry. "I'm just trying to fix this." Harry laughed, but it was cold and sharp. "You can't fix this. You ruined it." He took a step back, shaking his head. "You're selfish, Mom. All you care about is what you want." Tears stung Jennifer's eyes, but she blinked them back. "That's not true. I'm doing this for us." "No," Harry interrupted, his voice steady now, almost calm. "You're doing this for you. You didn't think about me or Dad. You didn't care how this would tear us apart." She reached out to him, desperate to hold on to something. Anything. "Harry, please, I can fix it. Just give me time. Don't tell your father. I'll make it right. I'll make everything right." He stared at her hand but didn't take it. For a long moment he just stood there, his face unreadable. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away. "Harry!" she called after him, but he didn't stop. She watched helplessly as he disappeared through the restaurant's entrance. the sound of the door closing behind him echoing in her ears. Her whole body felt numb. She had lost control, and now everything was spiraling out of her hands. Taking a deep breath, she leaned against the wall, her mind racing. What was he going to do? Was he going to tell John? Was her marriage over? The life she had been carefully balancing now felt like it was crashing down around her, and she didn't know how to stop it. Her heart still pounding, Jennifer wiped at her eyes, trying to compose herself before heading back to the table where Davis waited. He looked up at her, concern crossing his face as she approached. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his voice cautious. She forced a smile, though it barely held. "Yeah," she lied, her voice hollow. "Just a little family issue." Davis nodded, but his eyes lingered on her, sensing something was off. He reached for her hand again, but this time she didn't respond, her mind too distracted by what had just happened. As the night wore on, Jennifer couldn't shake the dread that filled her chest. Harry knew, and if he told John, there would be no coming back from this. The life she had been planning, the future she had envisioned with Davis, it could all disappear in an instant. For the first time, she realized just how fragile everything really was. After Harry's departure, Jennifer had barely managed to compose herself. Her heart pounded. The image of her son's devastated face burned in her mind. Davis had noticed something was off, but she had waved it away with a hurried excuse about a family emergency. They paid the bill quickly and left the restaurant, Davis insisting on driving her back to his place to clear her head. But Jennifer's thoughts were far too chaotic to focus on his reassurances. "Are you sure everything's okay?" Davis asked as they sped through the city streets. His hand rested on her thigh, but she barely registered the touch. "It's fine," she muttered, her mind racing. What would Harry do? Had he gone straight to John? The guilt gnawed at her, but she shook it off. She couldn't afford to panic now. Davis glanced at her sideways, sensing her discomfort. "If you want, I can talk to him, make him understand the situation," Davis offered. "No," Jennifer said quickly, turning to him. "Just let me handle this." When they arrived at Davis's penthouse, Jennifer's phone buzzed in her purse. She glanced at the screen. A text from John, "We need to talk." Her heart sank. It was already too late. "I need to go home," Jennifer said abruptly, her voice sharper than she intended. Davis looked at her, confused. "Now? It's late. You're stressed. Stay the night, we'll talk in the morning." She shook her head, already gathering her things. "No, I have to go. I need to fix this before it gets worse." Davis didn't push further. He stood there as she left his apartment, his concern palpable, but Jennifer had no time to address it. She had bigger problems waiting for her at home. The drive back to her house felt like it took hours, though it was only a short distance. Jennifer's mind raced, replaying every moment with Harry, every possible way he could have told John. When she pulled into the driveway, the streetlights illuminated the front of her house. Everything looked normal, except it wasn't. The house was dark. Not a single light was on inside. John always left a light on for her, even when they argued. Her stomach churned. She grabbed her purse and got out of the car, rushing up the walkway. The porch light flickered, casting long shadows that only made her feel more uneasy. She reached for the doorknob and twisted it. Locked. Jennifer frowned. They never locked the door when one of them was out. She fumbled in her bag for her keys, her pulse quickening. She found the house key and slid it into the lock. It didn't fit. "What the hell?" she muttered, pulling the key out and trying again. She jiggled it, forcing it into the lock, but it wouldn't turn. Panic flared. The locks had been changed. "John!" she called out, banging on the door. "John, open the door. What's going on?" No response. "Harry?" Her voice wavered as she knocked again, harder this time. Silence. She took a step back, confused and terrified. Before she could think of her next move, the door swung open. Harry stood there, emotionless, his face unreadable. "Well, what is going on?" Jennifer stammered, her voice rising. She tried to push past him into the house, but Harry blocked her way. "Dad knows," Harry said, his tone flat. Her heart dropped. "Harry, please, you didn't—" she started, but her son cut her off. "Here." He thrust a stack of papers into her hands. Jennifer stared down at them, her eyes wide. Divorce papers. Her knees buckled slightly, but she caught herself. "No, no, this can't be happening. You didn't mean to do this. You don't understand." "I understand perfectly," Harry said coldly. "I understand that you lied to us, that you betrayed Dad and me." Jennifer's breath hitched. She tried to say something, anything, but no words came out. She looked at Harry, searching his face for some sign of compassion, some trace of the boy she had raised. But all she saw was anger and disappointment. "This isn't right," she whispered. "This can't be right." Ignoring her plea, Harry continued. "This is from Dad." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, neatly wrapped box. It looked harmless enough, almost like a gift. Jennifer stared at it, her fingers trembling as she took it from him. "What is this?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Open it," Harry said, stepping aside. Her hands shook as she fumbled with the wrapping paper, tearing it away to reveal a velvet box. Slowly, she opened the lid. Inside was a small, blood-stained handkerchief wrapped around something cold and metallic. Her breath caught in her throat as she peeled back the fabric. A blade, small, sharp, and engraved with Davis's initials. She let out a strangled gasp, stumbling backward. Her mind whirled. Asterisk, how did John get this? How did he know about Davis? Asterisk. Her legs gave out, and she collapsed onto the cold porch, her world crashing down around her. The box slipped from her hands, the blade clattering onto the ground. Harry stood above her, unmoved. "Dad thought it was fitting," he said coldly. "You could give it to Davis the next time you see him." Jennifer shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Harry, please, don't do this." He stared at her, his eyes cold and distant. "I don't want a new rich dad, Mom. I never did. I love the one I have. But I want a new mom." And Dad said yes. Her chest tightened, and she reached out toward him, desperate to pull him back. But Harry stepped away, leaving her alone on the porch, her life shattered. The door clicked shut behind him, and the silence that followed was deafening. Jennifer clutched the divorce papers, the blade, and the memories of the life she had destroyed. The locks had been changed, and so had everything else. The house had never felt so empty, so still. After Jennifer stormed off into the night, John remained at the kitchen table, staring at the divorce papers. He couldn't bring himself to sign them yet. Not because he still had feelings for her, but because it felt surreal, 25 years of marriage reduced to a few sheets of paper. The betrayal hit him harder than he thought it would. He had always trusted her, always believed in their life together. Harry sat across from him, arms folded across his chest, his face hard-set in an expression that made him look older than his 25 years. The silence between them stretched on until Harry finally broke it. "She didn't deserve you," he said coldly, his voice cutting through the heavy quiet. John sighed, rubbing a hand over his tired face. "No, she didn't," he replied quietly. "But it's over now. There's nothing left to salvage." Harry's jaw tightened. "It's not over. Not yet," he said, leaning forward, his voice filled with a dark determination. "She hurt you, Dad. She doesn't just get to walk away from this with him, like nothing happened." John raised an eyebrow, looking at his son curiously. "What are you talking about?" Harry's eyes flashed with anger as he recalled the night at the restaurant. "She tried to bribe me, Dad. Offered me a new rich dad in exchange for keeping my mouth shut, as if I'd sell you out for some cash and a fancy car." John's eyes widened in shock. "She tried to bribe you?" "Yeah," Harry said, nodding grimly. "She thinks she and that guy are untouchable because they've got money. But they're not. We can hit them where it hurts." John leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful as he processed what Harry was saying. "And what exactly do you have in mind?" Harry glanced at the divorce papers on the table, then back at his father. "You've given her everything for years, Dad. She's been living off your hard work, your money, your love. And now she wants to take it all and run off with him? No. She doesn't get to walk away unscathed. John frowned. I don't want to stoop to her level, Harry. I'm not going to play dirty. I'm not saying we play dirty, Harry replied, his voice steady. I'm saying we play smart. We know how she thinks. She's greedy, selfish, and arrogant. She's already made her move. Now it's our turn. John looked at his son, impressed by his resolve but unsure where he was going with this. What exactly are you suggesting? We hit them where it hurts most, Harry said, leaning in closer. In their pockets. Davis might be rich, but his reputation is everything to him. He's got a business empire built on his name, on his image as this upstanding, successful guy. If something were to tarnish that image. John's brow furrowed. You're talking about going after his business? Exactly, Harry nodded. We find out what skeletons are in his closet. No one gets that rich without making enemies or cutting corners. I guarantee there's dirt on him somewhere. We just need to dig it up. John hesitated. I'm not sure about this. I don't want to get involved in something shady. Harry leaned back, crossing his arms again. It's not shady if we're just exposing the truth. He deserves to lose everything after what he's done. And as for Mom, Harry paused, the anger rising in his voice again. She needs to feel what it's like to have everything she thought was hers ripped away. John rubbed his temples, trying to make sense of it all. Part of him wanted to let it go, to move on and not get consumed by bitterness. But another part, the part that had been humiliated and blindsided by Jennifer's betrayal, wanted justice. And how do we even begin to do something like this? John asked. I've already started, Harry said with a slight smirk on his face. I've been following Davis's business dealings for a while. He's not as clean as he pretends to be. I have a contact who can help us dig deeper, find out where he's vulnerable. John looked at his son with a mix of surprise and pride. Harry had always been sharp, but he had never seen this side of him. You've really thought this through, John said. Of course, Harry replied. I'm not letting her get away with destroying our family. I'm not going to just sit by and watch her run off with everything you worked for. John was quiet for a long moment, thinking. His son's plan wasn't without merit. If they could expose Davis's shady dealings, it would be a blow that neither he nor Jennifer could recover from. But it was risky, and John had never been the vengeful type. What if this backfires? John asked. What if they come after us? They won't, Harry said confidently. We'll be careful. We'll do this the right way. Besides, if we play this smart, they won't even see it coming. John sighed, weighing his options. He had spent years being the steady, reliable one, the one who always took the high road. But maybe, just this once, it was time to fight back, to show Jennifer that actions had consequences. All right, John said finally, his voice firm. Let's do it. Let's take him down. Harry smiled, a glint of satisfaction in his eyes. You won't regret this, Dad. John stood up from the table, feeling a surge of energy he hadn't felt in days. For the first time since Jennifer's betrayal, he felt like he was taking control of his life again. We start tomorrow, he said. But we do it carefully. No mistakes. Agreed. Harry nodded, standing up as well. We'll make sure they never see it coming. As they left the kitchen, John felt a strange sense of relief. The plan wasn't about revenge for its own sake. It was about reclaiming what was his, about showing Jennifer and Davis that they couldn't destroy him and walk away without consequences. Tomorrow, the real fight would begin. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity for John and Harry. What had started as a vague idea of revenge quickly became a carefully orchestrated campaign. They spent long nights in John's home office, poring over documents, making calls, and piecing together a strategy that would not only expose Davis's corruption but ruin him completely. John had never considered himself a vengeful person, but after everything Jennifer had done, something inside him had snapped. His life had been shattered, his trust destroyed, and the thought of letting them walk away unscathed seemed impossible to accept. Harry, for his part, was fueled by his own anger. Not just for what Jennifer had done to his father, but for how she had tried to manipulate him into silence. One evening, Harry sat at the kitchen table, his laptop open in front of him. "I found it," he said, his eyes scanning the screen. John looked up from a stack of old business files. "Found what?" "Davis's dirty little secret," Harry said, tapping a few keys and turning the screen toward his father. "He's been embezzling funds from one of his companies for years. Offshore accounts, shell companies, it's all here." John leaned forward, staring at the documents on the screen. "How did you get this?" Harry smiled slightly. "I told you I have a contact who's good at digging up dirt. It wasn't easy, but once we knew where to look, it all fell into place." John's eyes narrowed as he read through the files. Davis had been siphoning money out of his own company, hiding it in offshore accounts to avoid taxes and inflate his profits. If this information went public, it would destroy him. His entire business empire was built on the illusion of success, and one crack in that foundation would bring the whole thing crashing down. "This is it," John said quietly, the weight of the moment settling in. "This is what we've been waiting for." Harry nodded. "We just need to make sure it gets into the right hands. Once the authorities see this, Davis is done." John sat back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "And Jennifer? We're already working on her," Harry said, closing the laptop and standing up. "I've been talking to some of her so-called friends. It didn't take much to get them to start talking. You know how those women are, always gossiping. I planted a few rumors about her affair with Davis, and now it's spreading like wildfire." John raised an eyebrow. "How far has it spread?" "Far enough," Harry replied. "It's not just her social circle anymore. It's reached her workplace, her charity events, everywhere. She's being blacklisted left and right. People don't want to be associated with her now that they know she's the one who destroyed our family." John felt a twinge of guilt at the thought of Jennifer being ostracized, but it quickly passed. She had made her choices, and now she was facing the consequences. He couldn't afford to feel sorry for her, not after what she had done. "What about Davis?" John asked. "How's he handling all of this?" Harry smirked. "Not well. His assets are frozen, and he's been trying to figure out who's behind it, but every time he makes a move, we're 2 steps ahead of him. His lawyers are scrambling to protect him, but they don't even know what they're up against yet." John nodded slowly, feeling a sense of satisfaction creeping in for the first time in weeks. He felt like he was in control again. Good, John thought. Let him sweat. The next morning, John sat in his office, staring at his phone. The contact Harry had lined up was about to make the first call to the authorities. It was a critical step, one that would set everything into motion. Once the embezzlement was exposed, Davis's world would come crashing down. But as he sat there, waiting for the call, John felt a pang of hesitation. Was this really the right thing to do? Revenge had consumed so much of his time and energy over the past few weeks, but now that the moment was here, doubt began to creep in. He had never been a vengeful person. He had always believed in taking the high road, but the hurt Jennifer had caused was too deep. The thought of letting them walk away unscathed felt unbearable. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. He picked it up and saw Harry's name on the screen. "It's done," Harry said when John answered. "Already?" John asked, his heart pounding. "Yeah, the call's been made. They're going to start looking into Davis's finances. It won't take long before everything comes out." John sat back in his chair, exhaling slowly. Good. There was a pause on the other end of the line before Harry spoke again. "You okay, Dad?" John hesitated, just thinking. "About what?" "About whether we're doing the right thing." Harry was silent for a moment before replying. "They deserve this. Both of them. We're not the bad guys here." "I know," John said quietly. "It's just hard. I never thought we'd end up here." "I didn't either," Harry admitted. "But we are, and they need to pay for what they did to us." John nodded, even though Harry couldn't see him. "You're right." They hung up, and John sat there for a few minutes, staring out the window. He knew what they were doing was necessary, but it didn't make it any easier. He had loved Jennifer once. They had built a life together, raised their son together. Now all of that was gone and there was no going back. A few days later, the fallout began. Davis's business was hit hard when the financial fraud came to light. His name was dragged through the mud in the media, and his investors started pulling out. Lawsuits followed, and within a matter of weeks, his once thriving empire was in shambles. He tried to fight back to contain the damage, but it was too late. The trap had been set, and now he was caught in it. Meanwhile, Jennifer found herself increasingly isolated. The rumors about her affairs spread faster than she could control, and soon, even her closest friends were avoiding her. Her job was on the line, and her social standing was destroyed. She had no idea how things had spiraled so quickly. No matter what she did, she couldn't stop the bleeding. Every time they tried to fight back, they found themselves one step behind. Every move they made was anticipated, countered, and blocked. It was as if someone was pulling the strings from the shadows, guiding their downfall at every turn. But no matter how hard they searched, they couldn't figure out who it was. And that was exactly how John and Harry wanted it. The trap had been set, and now Jennifer and Davis were paying the price. Jennifer stood outside Davis's lavish penthouse, gripping her phone tightly. The screen blinked with dozens of missed calls from her lawyer, each voicemail worse than the last. She could feel her world crumbling beneath her feet. Everything, her carefully built life, the comfort and luxury she had surrounded herself with, was disintegrating. She shoved the phone in her coat pocket and rang the doorbell. The familiar chime echoed through the hallway, but there was no comfort in it anymore. When Davis opened the door, he looked like he hadn't slept in days. His hair was disheveled, his suit wrinkled, and the confident gleam that once lit up his face was gone. "Where have you been?" he demanded, his voice tense. He glanced past her, checking the hallway nervously, as if someone might be watching. "I've been calling you. Where do you think I've been?" Jennifer snapped, stepping inside and brushing past him. She felt the cool air from the apartment hit her face, but it did nothing to soothe the storm raging inside her. "Everything's falling apart, Davis." "I know," he muttered, closing the door behind her. "You think I don't know that?" Jennifer stood in the center of the living room, arms crossed tightly over her chest. The penthouse, once a symbol of the new life she had planned to start with Davis, now felt like a gilded cage. It had been their safe space, their refuge from the chaos of their affair. Now it was just another reminder of how quickly everything could be taken away. "They've frozen our accounts," Jennifer said, her voice shaking. "Do you understand what that means? We have nothing left." Davis paced back and forth in front of her, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't know they had this much dirt on me," he snapped, frustration boiling over. "Someone's been digging for months, Jennifer. This isn't just bad luck. Someone is pulling strings." Jennifer's heart pounded in her chest. She already knew the answer to the question Davis hadn't asked. It had been gnawing at her since the moment the rumors started, since the moment their world began to unravel. She took a deep breath and spoke quietly, almost as if saying it aloud would make it more real. "It's John," she whispered. Davis stopped pacing and stared at her, his eyes narrowing. "What?" Jennifer swallowed hard. "It's John. He's doing this. He and Harry, they know everything. I saw the way Harry looked at me that night at the restaurant. He didn't just see me with you, Davis. He knew. They both knew." Davis's face twisted with anger. "So what? They've been planning this from the start." Jennifer nodded, feeling the weight of it all pressing down on her. "I think so. They're behind everything. The rumors, the frozen accounts, the investigation. They've been playing us, Davis," Jennifer said, her voice cracking with frustration. Davis slammed his fist against the wall in anger. "Then we fight back," he growled, his voice rising. "We're not going to let them get away with this." Jennifer shook her head, her throat tightening. "It's too late. The lawyers say there's nothing we can do. John's been too careful. We can't even trace anything back to him." Davis's eyes blazed with fury. "There has to be something. They can't just ruin me like this. I've worked too hard for everything I have. And what about what I've lost?" Jennifer snapped, her voice sharp. "My life is over. My reputation is in ruins. I've lost all my friends, and now I've lost you too. All because of that damn family." Davis turned to her, his face contorted with anger. "This is not just about you, Jennifer. Do you know how many people depend on me? My company, my employees, this isn't just personal. They've destroyed everything I've built." Jennifer took a step closer, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and fury. "And you promised me we'd be fine. You said we'd be better off with each other. Look where we are now, Davis. I've left my family, my life, and for what? For this." She gestured to the penthouse, which now felt cold and lifeless despite its grandeur. Davis's fists clenched, his jaw tight. "I didn't know this would happen," he muttered. Jennifer's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away, refusing to break down. "And now what? What are we supposed to do? Run? Hide? What's left for us, Davis?" Davis didn't respond. He turned away, looking out over the city through the massive windows that lined the living room. The skyline stretched out before them, glittering and bright, but it felt miles away, unreachable. His empire, the life he had built, was crumbling beneath him, and he had no idea how to stop it. "We fight," he muttered, but the words sounded hollow, even to him. He didn't believe them anymore. Jennifer shook her head, her voice soft. "It's over, Davis. They've won." There was a long silence between them, broken only by the distant hum of the city below. Jennifer felt the enormity of the situation pressing down on her, crushing her chest. This was supposed to be their fresh start, their new beginning, but now it was nothing more than ashes. Suddenly, Davis's phone buzzed on the coffee table. He glanced at the screen and let out a curse. "They've launched a full audit of my company," he said, his voice tight with anger. "I'm under investigation for financial fraud. This will kill me, Jennifer. There's no coming back from this." Jennifer stared at him, the finality of his words sinking in. "So this is it?" Davis didn't answer, but the look on his face said everything. He had no more cards to play, no more tricks up his sleeve. John and Harry had outmaneuvered them at every turn, and now they were trapped. Jennifer sank down onto the couch, her hands trembling. "What do we do now?" Davis sighed, rubbing his temples as if trying to ease the pounding headache that had been growing for days. "We try to survive," he said quietly, "but it won't be the life we planned." She nodded, the weight of her choices bearing down on her. She had left everything behind for a future with Davis, but now that future was gone, and there was no turning back. She had gambled everything on this affair, and she had lost it all. The penthouse, once a symbol of freedom and excitement, now felt like a prison. For the first time since it all began, Jennifer realized just how far she had fallen. As the reality of their situation set in, Jennifer and Davis sat in silence, both knowing that there was no escape from the consequences of their choices. They had lost everything: money, reputation, and the trust of those they had betrayed. Months had passed since the storm that tore John's life apart, and yet, as he stood in the living room of his new home, a small smile tugged at the corners of his lips. The house was smaller, cozier than the one he had once shared with Jennifer, but it wasn't about size anymore. This place was his sanctuary, quiet, peaceful, and free of the weight of past betrayals. The morning light filtered through the windows, casting a soft glow on the simple but warm decor. It was a house that felt lived in, full of life, and most importantly, full of hope. John sipped his coffee as he looked around, feeling the sense of contentment that had eluded him for years. The faint sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway, and moments later, Harry appeared, holding another cup of coffee. He handed it to his father with a grin. "Here you go, Dad. I figured you could use a refill." John chuckled and took the cup. "You know me too well." Harry sat down across from him, leaning back into the armchair. There was a lightness in his posture, a calm that hadn't been there during the turmoil months ago. For both of them, this was a new chapter. They had been through hell together, but they had come out stronger. There was a bond between father and son now, unshakable and rooted in trust. "You've done a lot for me," John said, glancing at his son. I don't think I'd be here if it weren't for you. Harry shook his head. We did this together. You taught me what loyalty means. I couldn't just sit by and watch her destroy you. John sighed, a trace of the old pain surfacing briefly. I never saw it coming. I thought I knew her. That's what makes it hurt, John said quietly, the pain still lingering in his voice. Harry replied softly, but you don't have to carry that weight anymore. You've moved on. We've both moved on. John smiled, the lines around his eyes softening. He looked out the window to the backyard, where the morning breeze rustled through the trees. It's strange. After everything, I thought I'd feel empty, but now, I just feel free. At that moment, Rose stepped into the room, carrying a basket of fresh laundry. Her presence immediately warmed the space. She was a woman who had come into John's life during his darkest days, offering support and understanding when he needed it most. What began as a friendship, a shoulder to lean on, had blossomed into something deeper. Laundry's done, Rose said, her voice light. She set the basket down and walked over to John, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. How are you two doing this morning? Better with this coffee, John replied with a grin, holding up his cup. Harry glanced between them and smiled knowingly. I'm going to head out and give you two some time, he said, standing up. He gave his father a pat on the back. You've earned it. John watched his son leave, pride swelling in his chest. Harry had grown into a man he could be proud of, a man who had stood by him when everything fell apart. As the front door closed behind him, John turned to Rose, who had taken a seat beside him. How are you feeling about the move? She asked, her eyes full of concern but also understanding. John took a deep breath, looking around the house once more. I feel good. For the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm where I'm supposed to be. Rose smiled, her hand still resting on his arm. You deserve this peace, John. You've been through so much. He looked at her, his heart swelling with gratitude. I wouldn't have made it through without you, Rose. You helped me when I didn't know how to help myself. She shook her head gently. You've always been strong, John. I just reminded you of it. Their hands found each other's, and for a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, both knowing that this, right here, right now, was their new beginning. Meanwhile, miles away in a cold, empty apartment, Jennifer sat alone by the window. Her eyes were hollow, her face pale, as she stared out at the world that seemed to have left her behind. The once lavish surroundings, the apartment Jennifer had once shared with Davis now felt lifeless, devoid of the excitement she had once craved. Davis was nowhere to be seen, off fighting legal battles that he was destined to lose. The investigation into his business dealings had uncovered everything John and Harry had worked so hard to expose. His empire had crumbled, and so had their life together. They had been living in the shadow of their choices, and now, all that was left was the bitter taste of regret. Jennifer sighed, her mind drifting back to the family she had torn apart. She had thought she was chasing freedom, excitement, something more than the life she had with John. But in the end, all she had done was destroy the only real stability she had ever known. She thought of Harry, her son, and the look in his eyes the night he caught her with Davis. He had been the first to leave her, the first to see her for what she had become. And John had moved on, found happiness, and rebuilt a life that no longer included her. The irony wasn't lost on her. In her search for something better, she had ended up with nothing. The life she had envisioned with Davis, filled with wealth and glamour, had turned to ashes in her hands. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. It was Davis, looking as defeated as she felt. They've taken everything, he said quietly, not even bothering to close the door behind him. We're finished. Jennifer didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. Back at John's new home, the sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the yard. John stood with Rose on the back porch, watching the trees sway gently in the breeze. For the first time in years, he felt like the burdens of the past had been lifted, and in their place was hope for the future. I never thought I'd be here, John murmured, his arm around Rose's waist. But I'm glad I am. Rose leaned her head on his shoulder. So am I. Together, they watched the sun dip below the horizon, knowing that this was the start of something beautiful. The past was behind them, and in its place was a future filled with peace, love, and new beginnings.